make Charlie your father, Biff. You can't do that, can you? I am not saying he's a great man. Willie Loman never earned a lot of money. His name was never in the paper. He's not the finest character that ever lived. But he's a human being. And a terrible thing is happening to him. So attention must be paid. He must not be allowed to fall into his grave like an old dog. Attention. Attention must finally be paid to such a person. You called him crazy?
Mom, I didn't...
Wait a minute. A lot of people think he's lost his balance, but you don't have to be very smart to know what his trouble is. The man is exhausted.
Sure.
A small man can be just as exhausted as a great man.
Charlie and Bernard. Willie himself, Biff, happy? Randy gets the ball rolling, providing numerous excellent examples of both Charlie and Bernard behaving chorally. Once which, quote, highlight that while indeed they were actively involved with the family throughout the play, their reasoning and compassion for the Lomans set them apart and allowed them to subtly provide us with comments that enhanced our perspectives on the true nature of the Lomans. Well, many of you agreed. Rachel, the two quote, summarize and help us interpret events happening within the play while standing apart from and having little effect on Willie. Maggie, quote, their comments are not idiosyncratic, but, quote, reflect norms and pressures from society. Thus, these two satisfy what we could distinguish as the three criteria offered by Abrams and Harpham in the glossary. They stand apart from and do not shape the action. They comment on that action. They're not indifferent to it. They're not silent about it. And they comment not as oddballs, for all the use of that term special perspective, sometimes an ironic one. It's nevertheless a representative perspective that they offer. They comment in accordance with a group, a community, a culture, or a society. Though I disagree with Angelina that the course needs to be very intelligent or logical, they in fact can be quite emotional, as in Antigone. Charlie, who is, quote, the sane and extrospective character in the play, as opposed to introspective the way Willie is, so harmfully, quote, gives the audience a clear understanding of what is going on with the characters. He gives voice to group norms, which may be a pretty good definition of sanity's own speech, provided the group not be too small or too weird. He's the, as Xavier puts it, voice of reason, as it speaks in Willie's community, the neighborhood. Amira, Samantha, and Sydney, do we really need a formal narrator? I wondered about this. Go back to Antigone and its classic example of a chorus. Does the choral voice narrate or in some other way lead us through the play or move along the story? As Rachel puts it, often choruses, in fact, pause the action as the chorus blabs on and on. You might have felt that way about Antigone's chorus on occasion. Most theorists and historians of the chorus do not require that it be the play's storyteller any more than they require that it be one of the play's significant actors. Do choruses tell, typically, or do they help illuminate what's been told, what's been shown? Most would say the latter. Hey, what about Biff? I know a number of you got interested, or several of you got interested towards the end of the discussion. Interesting, Xavier says, and Randy agrees, Biff is able at times to, quote, break from the family's toxic tradition and attain a, quote, distinct persona, one distinct from the family. As Happy is not, Happy tends to ape Willie's attitudes, and I think we find this especially poignant at the very end, when he looks as though he's going to carry on that toxic tradition, as Randy put it. Maggie, quote, throughout the play, Biff comments on Willie's increasingly strange actions, and, quote, these actions are seen as unacceptable, representing the norms we hold in our society. Placing the expectations of society on another character is an indicator of a choral character. Well, I think I say truly to Maggie simply because, I mean, I think it can be an indicator, but I don't think it's enough to indicate that we have a choral character, because we have characters all the time who are deeply involved in the action and don't have that apartness that seems to be required for the chorus, right? And they are commenting in ways that are fairly social, right? That are fairly conventional, and they place expectations of society and other characters, right? What we're looking for with the chorus is a consistent distance combined with that placing of expectations, which is typically consistent with a particular society, right? So I think what we have here is more accurately spoken of as a kind of choral moment, or if you remember what we were talking about in the question of genre, a choral mode. I think now and then the characters like speak in the choral mode without themselves being choral characters. Okay, disagreeing with this majority, who find Charlie, or in some cases Charlie and Bernard, choral, Joe acutely notes that the content of Charlie's character, whether he is, quote, kind, Keandra and Elizabeth, judgmental, Sydney, or a good friend, Mariah, at some point in our discussion becomes the choral criterion. This is something to which Joe objects nicely. Elizabeth, quote, Charlie and Bernard are esteemed citizens who work hard for what they have and value having good morals. And I couldn't agree more. However, moral or intellectual, any other sort of character content, how much does that matter to the question of whether these particular individuals represent a choral perspective? What matters is whether Charlie, for example, quote, stands apart from the action, and of course comments on the action go through the criteria again, usually from a particular communal or cultural point of view. Abrams and Harfin. And note Hawthorne's demand that the chorus exhibit social otherness with respect to, for example, the specific, social perspective of the hero or so. For example, Antigone's chorus seems to come from a slightly different social space than that which is occupied by Crayon, who is, of course, an occupant of the palace, and they are not like palace courtiers, right? They're a little bit further out. There's a little bit of otherness from which we get the sense of a distinct, to go back to some of that language used earlier in this panel, in this answer that you guys have offered, a kind of distinct social persona, distinct from the family, for example. And Charlie, Joe asserts, doesn't, right? Charlie doesn't stand apart from the action, Joe said. A properly choral character cannot be a significant actor in the drama. And Charlie's, quote, participation in the actions of the story, Joe asserts, incriminate, or I think the word disqualify would work just as well, disqualify him, his candidacy for the chorus, for choral candidate. Well, I wonder about this. How much does he? Would not this criterion, by the way, I also want to mention, disqualify Joe's own nominee, Willie himself, whom Samantha in her response calls two completely different choral characters? Yes, Willie comments on his own character in the action, but so does Crayon, who nobody would take for the chorus. Neither would appear to represent, either Crayon nor Willie, a group or community, apart from that occupied by Willie. Do you see how it just sort of doesn't work? The other thing about Willie, and the other thing about Crayon, they are radical individuals, and they are the protagonists, as Keandra puts it. The protagonist cannot be the chorus, okay? Unless maybe he has a split person or she has a split personality, right? Which I guess you guys were almost kind of arguing that. So I found it very intriguing what you were saying, but I wonder whether it would really work, if we pursued the point fully. By contrast, Charlie, quote, displays a much more common norm of success in society, as Xavier puts it. And as Randy agrees, he really sees Willie in a way that his own family doesn't. Okay, and it's sort of difficult for Willie to see himself in a way that his own family, Willie's own family, that Willie himself doesn't. Well, leaving aside Joe's characterization of Charlie's actions, which most of you did not share, and I will confess that I agree, Charlie doesn't really do that much. It doesn't seem to me that he really is involved. He doesn't shape the action, right? So it seems to me he could still qualify. Note how Joe also admits that alone, significant participation might be not enough to disqualify, which I thought was a wise, canny little qualification that Joe introduced at the end of one of his contributions. And it's also a point which points us to the next panel. Okay, wait a second, time out. Let's just take a moment here, okay, to make an important point. Of course, to have your chorus or choral character affect the hero's actions at all, is that not to do something innovative? Isn't it a stretch? Isn't it to stretch a rule of the genre? Isn't it to modify a convention? I want to introduce this notion of a literary convention, and we're going to be talking about this a little bit below, right? It's been said that the chorus, which sees Clytemnestra in the play Agamemnon, which is one of the great Greek tragedies, it's been said that the chorus in that play, which sees Clytemnestra, knife in hand, approach Agamemnon as he sits in his bath, is not allowed to warn him okay, bearing witness to what's about to happen. They're not allowed to rush in and save him. It's just against the rules. Choruses can't do things like that, okay? They can't be involved. It's not a matter of their simply not being involved. It goes against the convention, the literary, as it were, kind of unspoken agreement and expectation, okay, of authors who write in these particular genres. But think about what happens when we get more modern, right? And you get the feeling that a lot of these old genres, they're not being scrapped. They're being, in various ways, investigated and modified and kind of exploited is maybe the best word for them, right? What do we have, for example, in trifles? I want you to think about this. Imagine that the two women, you remember them, Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters, a chorus of two. Imagine them as the chorus of that play. That was originally going to be one of your items. Well, for whatever reason. A chorus of two uniting in the end to save a small t tragic heroine, Mrs. Wright, simply, if I think quite devilishly, by resuming choral convention and refusing to intervene in the action. Kind of go back to being a chorus, right? Start out maybe as a chorus, nobody's paying much attention to them. They're offering community commentary. You see the men there in the, on the scene early on as constituting a kind of competitive chorus, a rival chorus made of the men, which I think is a very interesting way of reading the play, right? Maybe with the possible exception of the district commissioner, right, or the DA, as it were, who was actually doing the investigating, right? It seems a little bit too involved, but the other two are just there to kind of offer statements, right? The women seem to be that as well, and you can imagine the play continuing with the two of them kind of falling into the background and showing up now and then to offer comments, to say this, to say that. But in fact, we see them take the stage, take center stage. Mrs. Wright is off stage. Tragedy is off stage, and we have this kind of subsection of tragedy, which features choral characters, if you will, right? Who, in fact, to the extent that there's any action in the play, they're the ones who act, and there's not much action in the play. I mean, all they really do is look in a bag, find something that's dead, and decide to leave it there, right? Even as they comment upon it. Let me reread that sentence. Resuming choral convention, this chorus of two, uniting in the end to resume choral convention and refuse to intervene in the action, which they could have done by presenting the dead bird to the men, even as they comment upon it, okay? Even as they, throughout, and I think even at the very end, are commenting upon the action. They, at the end, could, that's consistent throughout, but at the end, they could go back to just a commentary, right? Just the function of commentary is their only function at the very end. And you can see this as a devilish bit of fun. The topic isn't fun, but aesthetically, you can imagine that a glass bell is in fact doing some very interesting things here that are fairly playful in their own way, okay? So here's a generalization. Modern plays monkey with a convention. It's a pretty simple point, but I think it's a good one, right? And one that's very worth bearing in mind as we try to understand literary history and try to prepare ourselves to be English majors whose careers are going to be investigations of literary history. Modern plays monkey with the conventions. These long established rules of the genre get played with, monkeyed around with by moderns who want to write something like a tragedy, right? But don't feel that the old style, the old form is precisely fits what they're up to. Note how they do not, here's an important distinction. Note how these modern plays do not reject or ignore those conventions. Even if they do not venerate and obey them, they don't reject or ignore them. That's not the way to do it. That's not the way to get yourself taken seriously. It would appear when we look at literary history, you don't ignore, reject wholesale, right? You invoke and then transform. That seems to be the way to do it. And again, it speaks to the staying power of genre as much as it does to anything else, which was the whole point of our the last video, right? Was one of the big points of the last video was this remarkable staying power and stability of genre. At the same time, mutability of genre, the mutability and longevity of genre. Stability in some sort of essential core is stable, right, of these genres. even as they undergo this mutation. So they're still recognizable as tragedy or the tragic mode. But nobody would say that that's a Greek tragedy when you read Trifles, or you read Chekhov, or you read this play. Just let me note in passing what's down here, and I hope it's legible, which is in accordance with that star up above just after the first sentence. The first sentence was, but of course to have your chorus or choral character affect the hero's actions at all is to do something innovative, right? Well, do note how some critics think that an evidently passive and at best reactive Greek chorus, such as we have in Antigone, is more active and involved than we tend to recognize. You know, in other words, that fundamental premise of the inactivity of the chorus is something that some critics have called into question. I don't feel that they have done so all that compellingly, but it's still a very interesting claim. Hawthorne, for example, notes how many critics have long recognized how the chorus in Greek tragedies may be clearly, quote, clearly and directly involved in the action by doing such things as arguing, supplicating, or deceiving. And Hawthorne goes on to say, look, even when they're silent, they're just standing there, they make a difference. They're in a sense involved in the action. Yeah, but others, you know, they'll retort such things, right? That line, doing such things as arguing, supplicating, or deceiving. Well, these things, aren't they to be distinguished from things like burying, issuing decrees, committing suicide, right? Drawing your sword on your father, as Hymen does, right? I mean, there's certain actions that are really actions. Then there are other actions that are kind of like if you stretch, you know, when the Greek chorus wants to get into a discussion about with Crayon about the lawfulness of what he's doing, okay? And they end up celebrating some of the things that he is, some of his premises and whatnot. Is that really action at the same level as what Hymen is doing when he draws his sword? So, you know, you have an argument about this. You have a debate on this whole question of whether that convention, as we recognize it, is really there, okay? But I think the consensus is that there is a difference between what a choral character is doing on a stage and what a non-choral character who's involved in the action is doing on the stage. For fans of Miss Frances and of Ben, perhaps, as candidates or nominees for the choral character, Barazzato and Catrombone might come to your assistance. They argue that choral groups assume different intra-dramatic, which means within the drama itself, identities according to the specific plots in which they partake. A similar attention to the choral intra-dramatic identity, which just means the identity taken up by the chorus in whatever drama he or she or it happens to be a part of, has provided a strong corrective against those interpreters who make too straightforward identifications between the tragic chorus and the civic collectivity, which is something we've been doing, right? That's what I was talking about before when I said I don't know about Miss Frances or I don't know about Ben, because what do they represent? Aren't they a bit elliptical and eccentric and a bit out there, as I said, a bit far out, right? Spatially, economically, socially. Arguing against such politicizing views of the tragic chorus, the famous Gold in 1996 convincingly maintains that tragic choruses quite often embody social groups that were perceived as marginal within Athenian 5th century society. So if you go back again, go back to the original convention as it was established by the Greeks, and you might find that there are, that there's a kind of a range of possibility with respect to the relationship between the chorus and the community surrounding the action of the play, right? Now, in Antigone, there's no doubt about it. They are like elders. They're referred to as old men, you will recall. They're like the city fathers. They're like the guys at the barbershop, but probably if one of the guys at the barbershop is also mayor of the town, right? That's who they are in Antigone, and that's who they are in lots of Greek tragedies, okay? But every now and then, as Gold argues, you get them representing something that's a little bit off, a little bit eccentric, a little bit out there, right? The chorus. And it's interesting. There isn't a one-to-one match between the chorus necessarily, even when you go back to the Greeks, in every tragedy between the chorus and the surrounding fairly conventional-minded, okay, community. And I think that's really interesting to keep that open as a possibility here of, for example, Miss Frances, whom you see here in a certain production of the play, being kind of romanced by Willie, and how would that scornful laugh, as some of you said, might itself constitute a choral comment. Where we've been heading this whole time is towards a concept, or a notion at least, of the literary convention and the power of conventions. I think this is no surprise to you, if you're still with me. To quote the Abrams and Harpham glossary, they have a wonderful, wonderfully helpful entry on this question. Quote, conventions are conspicuous features of subject matter, form, or technique that occur repeatedly in works of literature. Conventions, in a sense, may be recurrent types of character, choral character, turns of plot, reversal, medieval tragedy, forms of versification, the sonnet, or kinds of diction and style, iambic pentameter in poetry. Stock characters such as the Elizabethan braggart soldier, or the languishing and fainting heroine of Victorian fiction, or the sad young men of the lost generation novels of the 1920s, were among the conventions of their literary eras. And it's interesting how that Elizabethan braggart soldier is still around. I mean, look at, I don't know about Band of Brothers, but look at, for example, Saving Private Ryan, and the character played by Edward, I almost said Norton, what's his last name? You know the guy I'm talking about. He plays the guy with the big gun who complains a lot. And he might not be the best example of the braggart, but I think I don't know, Saving Private Ryan, maybe it's the character is the sniper, right? But you have these conventional figures who are still with us, right? Who were introduced a long time ago. To continue, the abrupt reform of the villain at the end of the last act was a common convention of melodrama. Euphuism, which is high and flowery language in prose, and the Petrarchan and metaphysical conceits in verse were conventional devices of style. It is now just as much a matter of literary convention to be outspoken on sexual matters as it was to be reticent in the age of Charles Dickens and George Eliot. So these conventions do change. It's over time, so we've seen there's a kind of mutability of literary genre and a mutability of literary convention as well. But I think what's would have been a better note to end on here, it seems to me, would have been how stable they are over time, even though, of course, there are all kinds of innovations upon them and changes and mutations. It's remarkable how you can still find them from very earlier works. They don't just get scrapped every generation and we form a whole new set of them. It's not the way it works. Yeah, a final word on conventions. You associate the word convention probably with the adjective conventional, which is not necessarily a term of approbation. When I think of very conventional people I know, I tend to think of them as fairly shallow people. They just observe the rules, and they do what they've been told to do, and they do what they've been taught to do, and they don't innovate, and they don't invent, okay? Here's what Harpham and Abrams have to say on that topic. Quote, invention was originally a term used in theories of rhetoric and later in literary criticism to signify the finding of the subject matter by an orator or a poet. It then came to signify innovative elements in a work, in contrast to the deliberate imitation of the forms and subjects of prior literary models. And you can see how that would work to the extent that you're imitative of forms and subjects of prior literary models, you're being very conventional. At the present time, invention is often opposed to convention in sense 2 above, which is the sense that was quoted in the previous plate, to signify the inauguration by a writer of an unprecedented subject or theme or form or style, and the resulting work is said to possess originality. Who would not want to be thought an original, right? So does that mean you need to be very inventive, give yourself over to invention, and try to be as unconventional as possible. Try not to observe conventions. Try to reject all the conventions, right? Is that the way it works? Repeatedly in the history of literature, innovative writers such as John Donne, Walt Whitman, James Joyce, or Virginia Woolf rebel against reigning conventions of their time to produce highly original works, only to have their inventions imitated by other writers, who thereby convert literary novelties into an additional set of literary conventions. And I think we've already seen some evidence of this when we're talking about genre, right? Where what looked to be this kind of mutation, it was taking us pretty far outside of the province of recognizable tragedy, ends up becoming this thing called, by way of its approach to comedy, this thing called tragicomedy, and has its own set of literary conventions that grow up in its own, what seemed to be a brand new and distinct field, that had nothing to do, and scorn the whole notion of a convention, the whole notion of a genre, suddenly becomes a genre in its own right with its own set of conventions. Okay, and you even look at Joyce and Woolf and Whitman and Donne, and I think what you'll see is, yes, there's radical innovation, but at the same time, once again, their innovations are such that you can see the conventions that they're transforming and transmogrifying. Okay, you can see them. You can see the conventions there. It's not as though it's just written in a vacuum, as though there's been no history whatsoever. And here Harfam and Abrams go on to say something similar to what I just said. There's nothing either good or bad in the extent or obviousness of conformity to pre-existing conventions. All depends on the effectiveness of the use an individual writer makes of them. The pastoral elegy, for example, is one of the most conspicuously convention-bound of literary forms. Yet in Lycidas, John Milton achieved what, by wide critical agreement, ranks as one of the greatest lyrics in the language. He did this by employing the ancient pastoral rituals, but not just imitating them. He imitated them, and he transformed them and employed them with freshness, a kind of newness and novelty and power, so as to absorb an individual's death into the universal human experience and to add to his voice the resonance of earlier pastoral laments for a poet who died young. So he very much wanted his voice to be heard as a kind of echo, okay, for all its own pitch, its own novel, unique pitch and tone and timbre. He didn't want you to forget about the voices that went before, that were heard before in the tradition. He wanted to line up his voice as the latest instance of that kind of expression of voice, that kind of pitch and timbre in tenor, okay? And so, once again, I think it shows the extent to which literary innovation, literary innovation and tradition kind of split the difference between them, right? And you rarely see a literary innovation that really takes hold of us and becomes powerful, okay, and becomes compelling, right? Except by way of its own, well, by way, number one, of the fact that it's, or the degree to which it itself gets imitated, therefore showing the power of imitation and the power of convention, or by showing that, or rather, you see it in its power by the degree to which, in fact, it participates in this kind of tradition and does not forget previous literary conventions, okay, even as it innovates upon them. But in fact, the emphasis becomes or falls on that, upon them, right, upon the foundations that exist already. That's the way literary history tends to work. Now, this video has been going on long enough, so I'm going to let you go at this point. Just to mention that Trofimov, okay, who a picture of whom Ethan Hawke. You thought it was Ethan Hawke. No, that was Trofimov in the last plate. Okay. Those of you who responded to the Trofimov prompt will have a separate, not a video, but a separate little item devoted to the good work that you did. Okay, so farewell for now.